This is the Mercedes W124, a car so well built it made Lexus nervous. So, why did Mercedes kill it off and replace it with one of the most rust-prone, problem-filled cars they have ever made? Let's dive into a story of engineering pride, corporate cost-cutting, and the car that became a legend by dying too soon. If you appreciate the craftsmanship of the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these stories alive. The story begins in the late 1970s. This was a time when the culture at Mercedes-Benz operated on a principle that seems almost alien to modern industry. The mandate given to the engineering teams was simple but profound. They were told to build the best possible automobile they could conceive. The instructions did not include a target price or a manufacturing budget. The finance department was told to wait until the car was finished to figure out how much it would cost to buy. This rare approach created a culture of cost, no object development. Development for the W124 began in the autumn of 1977. It would take 7 full years to bring the car to market. In the modern world of rapid prototyping and digital modeling, a 7-year development cycle is unheard of. But this time was used to perfect every single component. The engineers were not just building a new model, they were tasked with replacing the W123. That predecessor was already considered a legend of durability, a vehicle that had conquered the taxi ranks of the world. The pressure to improve upon perfection was immense. The visual identity of the car fell to a man named Bruno Sacco. He was the head of design, and he believed in a concept called vertical affinity. This meant that a mid-size sedan should share a clear visual lineage with the larger, more expensive models in the range. But more importantly, Sacco believed that a car should look timeless rather than trendy. He argued that a Mercedes-Benz should not look old after 3 years. It should look dignified for 30 years. This required a restraint that is rare in car design. There are no unnecessary lines. There is no styling for the sake of styling. Every curve and crease serves a functional purpose. The car had to possess a quiet authority, a sense of presence that did not need to shout to be heard. This philosophy extended deep beneath the metal skin. The testing protocols were exhaustive and punishing. The prototypes were driven for millions of kilometers in the most extreme climates on Earth. They were subjected to the freezing cold of the Arctic Circle to ensure the heater valves would not stick. They were driven through the blistering heat of the African desert to guarantee the cooling system could handle any load. The crash testing program was equally rigorous. Engineers smashed dozens of hand-built prototypes into concrete walls to understand exactly how the steel structure deformed. They were not just trying to pass a government regulation, they were trying to define what safety meant for the next decade. The sheer amount of money poured into research and development was staggering. It is estimated that the development costs ran into the billions of Deutsche Marks. This was not an investment in marketing or brand image. It was an investment in basic materials science, physics, and ergonomics. The company was willing to spend whatever was necessary to solve engineering problems that other manufacturers simply ignored. They created a car where the door hinges were overbuilt to handle decades of use. The seats were designed by orthopedic specialists to support the spine on long journeys. The paint was applied in thick, heavy layers to resist the elements. This limitless budget allowed for engineering solutions that seemed obsessive to outsiders. The limitless budget allowed the engineering teams to pursue efficiency in ways that had never been attempted on a mass-production sedan. Their first battleground was the air itself. In the early 1980s, most 4-door cars were aerodynamic disasters. They were shaped like bricks, pushing a wall of air in front of them, which created noise and wasted fuel. The team at Stuttgart decided that this new machine had to slice through the atmosphere with minimal resistance. They spent thousands of hours in the wind tunnel, refining the shape until they achieved a drag coefficient of just 0.28. To put that number into perspective, this squarish, conservative sedan was more aerodynamic than many pure sports cars of the era. It was a triumph of subtle geometry over aggressive styling, but achieving this number required more than just a sloping grille. It required a fanatical attention to surface details that most drivers would never even notice. This focus on airflow dictated the use of the plastic molding on the lower sides of the body. Enthusiasts know them today as Sacco planks. To the casual observer, they look like simple protective strips meant to guard the metal doors against stray shopping carts in a parking lot. While they certainly performed that function, their primary purpose was aerodynamic. They smoothed the airflow along the flanks of the car, reducing turbulence and keeping the body sides clean. It was a perfect example of form-following function, where a protective element was turned into a performance feature. But this obsession with airflow would lead to one of the most bizarre engineering solutions ever bolted onto a production car. A solution so strange that mechanics today still scratch their heads trying to understand it. The most famous example of this engineering eccentricity was found on the windshield. The engineers realized that at high speeds on the Autobahn, two standard windshield wipers created significant wind noise and turbulence. Their solution was to replace them with a single, massive arm. But a standard single wiper creates a simple arc, leaving the upper corners of the windshield dirty and reducing visibility. For a company obsessed with safety, this was unacceptable. So, they invented something completely new. They designed a complex eccentric cam mechanism located at the base of the wiper arm. As the wiper swept across the glass, the arm physically extended outwards to reach into the corners and then retracted as it passed the middle of the windshield. It moved with a strange hypnotic rhythm that looked almost biological. It was a mechanical solution that seemed vastly overcomplicated for a simple problem. Yet, it worked perfectly. It cleared 86% of the glass area, more than any two-wiper system on the market. It was heavy, expensive to manufacture, and terrifyingly complex to repair, but it provided the driver with a clearer view of the road. But how do you build a car that feels like a living room on the highway, yet corners like it is on rails? The answer lay beneath the chassis, in a system so sophisticated it would not become standard on luxury cars for another decade. This philosophy of complex solutions for superior results continued underneath the chassis. The rear suspension of the previous generation had been a simple semi-trailing arm design. It was durable, but it had limitations in handling. For the new model, the engineers developed a revolutionary multi-link rear axle. This system used 5 separate control arms for each rear wheel. It was a masterpiece of packaging. By using 5 distinct links, the engineers could separate the various forces acting on the wheel. They could tune the suspension to be soft and compliant over bumps, yet rigid and stable during cornering. It prevented the car from squatting under hard acceleration or diving under braking. This 5-link setup separated the ride comfort from the handling dynamics, proving that a comfortable car did not have to handle like a boat. It was so effective that this specific layout became the blueprint for almost all rear-wheel drive luxury cars that followed. But all this advanced aerodynamics and suspension wizardry meant nothing if the car did not hold together physically. Here is what separates a car that looks solid from a car that is solid, and why owners today will pay premium prices for a 40-year-old Mercedes over a brand new luxury sedan. The nickname "The Tank" was not a marketing slogan invented by an advertising agency. It was a label bestowed by the public who drove these cars. Underneath the paint lay a structure of high-strength steel that felt substantial in a way few vehicles do today. When you knock your knuckles against the fender of a modern car, it often sounds hollow and thin. When you do the same to this machine, it results in a dull, solid thud that suggests a density of material that has long since vanished from the automotive world. The engineers utilized extensive galvanization processes that were revolutionary for the time. Before a single drop of paint touched the body, the entire chassis was dipped in anti-corrosion baths. This was not done to make the car look shiny on the showroom floor. It was done to ensure that 20 years later, the structural integrity would remain uncompromised. The manufacturing team applied rust protection to cavities and seams that no owner would ever see. They sealed the underbody with a thick, rubberized coating that could withstand years of assault from road salt and gravel. Step inside, and the obsession with safety continues in places most people never look. Consider the wood trim on the dashboard. In a modern luxury car, the wood is often a paper-thin veneer glued onto plastic. In the W124, the Zebrano wood was backed by a sheet of aluminum. This was not for structural rigidity, it was a safety feature. If the car was involved in a severe collision, the aluminum backing ensured that the wood would not splinter into sharp shards that could injure the occupants. It was a decision that prioritized human safety over manufacturing cost. Then there is the upholstery. While leather was an option, the standard material was something called MB Tex. It was a high-grade vinyl that became legendary in its own right. It possessed a unique quality that seemed to defy the laws of entropy. A seat covered in this material could endure 300,000 miles of taxi passengers sliding in and out. and yet it would look nearly identical to the day it was installed. It did not crack, it did not fade, and it did not tear. It simply existed, impervious to time and use. This leads to an important distinction in the philosophy of the car. There is a difference between a car that is reliable and a car that is durable. A reliable car is one that never breaks down. A durable car is one that can be repaired indefinitely. The W124 was designed with the understanding that mechanical parts will eventually wear out. The engineers did not try to make magic components that lasted forever. Instead, they designed components that would wear out predictably rather than failing catastrophically. When a part reached the end of its life, it could be unbolted and replaced, returning the car to perfect working order. It was a machine designed to be maintained, not discarded. However, this era of engineering was not without its missteps. As the 1990s approached, the company began experimenting with environmentally friendly materials. This led to the infamous biodegradable wiring harnesses found in the later models. The insulation on these wires was designed to break down over time in a landfill. Unfortunately, the heat of the engine bay caused them to break down while the car was still in use. It is a flaw that frustrates owners to this day, but even this failure reflects the specific mindset of the time. It was an honest attempt to solve an environmental problem through material science, even if the execution was imperfect. Ultimately, the legend of the tank comes down to the tactile experience of operating it. It is felt in the resistance of the buttons on the center console. When you press a switch to lower the window, there is a firm mechanical click. It requires a deliberate amount of pressure. It feels heavy. It feels permanent. This is the result of a philosophy that valued the physical interaction between man and machine. The controls communicate a sense of solidity that assures the driver that everything is under control. While the standard W124 was over-engineered to this obsessive degree, there was one variant that took this philosophy to its absolute limit. It required one of the most absurd manufacturing processes in automotive history, a process so inefficient that it would be impossible to replicate today. If the standard W124 was a testament to durability, one specific variant stood as a monument to engineering excess. By nearly every metric of modern manufacturing, this car should not have existed. It was born from a desire to compete with the high-performance sedans emerging from Bavaria, but it evolved into something far more significant. The engineers wanted to take the massive 5-liter V8 engine from the S-Class flagship and force it into the medium-sized chassis of the E-Class. They created a machine that enthusiasts now revere as the wolf in sheep's clothing. To the untrained eye, the 500E looked almost identical to the taxicabs idling at the Frankfurt airport. It shared the same upright grille and the same sensible roofline, but a closer look revealed subtle, purposeful distortions. The fenders were flared outwards aggressively, stretching the width of the car to accommodate a wider track. The stance was lower, hunkered down over wider tires. It possessed a menacing muscular quality, like a bodybuilder wearing a tailored suit. However, these physical changes created a logistical nightmare that would become legendary. When the engineers finalized the design, they realized a critical problem. The widened fenders meant the car was physically too broad to fit down the standard assembly line in Sindelfingen. The production equipment simply could not accommodate the extra width. At the same time, the company's engineering resources were stretched thin, finalizing the massive W140S class. The solution was found in a neighboring city, with a company that had plenty of capacity but was struggling financially. That company was Porsche. What followed was perhaps the most inefficient production process in the history of mass-market automobiles. It was a complex industrial ballet performed between two factories. The process began at the Mercedes plant in Sindelfingen, where the body parts were stamped. These raw metal shells were then loaded onto trucks and driven across the city to the Porsche factory in Zuffenhausen. There, inside the Roslabau building, Porsche technicians hand-assembled the chassis, modifying the floor pans and welding the wider bodywork structures. Once the body was structurally complete, it was loaded back onto a truck and shipped back to Mercedes for painting, because Porsche did not have a paint shop capable of handling the volume or the specific colors required. After the paint was applied and inspected, the empty shell was put on a truck for a third time and sent back to Porsche. It was there, in the quiet halls of Zuffenhausen, that the massive V8 engine was installed by hand. The interior was fitted, the wiring was routed, and the final assembly was completed. Finally, the finished car was trucked back to Mercedes for final inspection and delivery. This circuitous journey meant that each 500e took 18 days to build. In an industry where cars are typically completed in hours, an 18-day production cycle is an eternity. It was a process that ignored perfection in favor of craft. The hand assembly by Porsche technicians ensured that the build quality was absolute. Every weld was checked, every panel gap was scrutinized, and every bolt was torqued with a level of care usually reserved for supercars. The result was a vehicle with a split personality. It cost roughly double the price of a standard E-Class, placing it in the same financial territory as a Rolls-Royce. The buyer was not the typical executive, but someone who valued discretion over display. On the Autobahn, it did not scream for attention. It simply gathered speed with the relentless force of a freight train. The heavy steering and the rigid chassis made 150 miles per hour feel as calm as 30 miles per hour. It was the ultimate expression of the W124 platform, proving that the chassis was so over-engineered, it could handle double the horsepower it was originally designed for without a single complaint. Yet, for most people, the legend of this generation was not built on speed, but on the accumulated miles of daily life. But the true legend of the W124 wasn't written on the Autobahn. It was written in the taxi ranks of Frankfurt, where this car proved something that modern engineering has forgotten how to do. While the 500e captured the imagination of the motoring press, the real appeal of the W124 was its refusal to die. It was written in the taxi queues of Frankfurt, the busy streets of London, and the dusty roads of North Africa. For the vast majority of buyers, the appeal of this machine was not 0 to 60 times, or cornering G-forces. It was the promise that the car would simply refuse to die. In Germany, the light ivory beige paint of the taxi variants became a ubiquitous part of the landscape. These cars were often equipped with the naturally aspirated diesel engines, power plants that were loud, slow, and utterly unrefined by modern standards. Yet, they possessed a durability that borders on the mythical. The engines, particularly the later six-cylinder OM606, were built with cast iron blocks and mechanical fuel injection systems that seemed immune to failure. It was not uncommon for these vehicles to cover 500,000 kilometers on their original internal components. There are documented examples that have crossed the million-mile mark, still serving their owners with the same faithful clatter they made on the day they were built. However, there is a widespread misconception about what this durability actually means. Owning a W124 does not mean owning a car that never breaks. It means owning a car that is infinitely repairable. The suspension bushings will wear out. The vacuum lines that control the door locks will eventually leak. The window regulators will tire. But, unlike modern vehicles, where a component failure often requires replacing an entire sealed module, every part of the W124 was designed to be disassembled and serviced. It rewards the owner who adheres to a strict maintenance schedule. If you change the fluids and replace the rubber components before they fail, the machine enters a state of mechanical equilibrium where it simply keeps going effectively forever. This philosophy extends to the driving experience itself, which is characterized by a single word, heft. Driving a W124 feels entirely different from driving a modern luxury sedan. The steering uses a recirculating ball system rather than the rack and pinion setup found in most cars today. This gives the steering a slightly vague feeling on center, but it provides immense stability at speed. The car tracks straight and true, ignoring crosswinds and road imperfections that would unsettle a lighter vehicle. It requires less mental energy to drive over long distances because the car seems to want to go in a straight line. The sensation from the driver's seat is also a reminder of what we have lost in the pursuit of safety regulations and aggressive styling. The cabin feels incredibly airy. The pillars that hold up the roof are thin and elegant, providing a panoramic view of the world outside. The belt line is low, meaning the glass area is enormous. When you sit behind the wheel, you can see all four corners of the car. You can see the road immediately in front of the bumper. The three-pointed star standing upright on the end of the hood serves not just as a status symbol, but as a functional sightline, helping the driver place the car perfectly in its lane. In contrast, getting into a modern vehicle often feels like descending into a bunker. The windows are narrow slits, the pillars are thick enough to hide a pedestrian, and the driver relies on cameras and sensors to know where the car ends. The W124 relies on simple, honest visibility. This is why enthusiasts today are hunting for clean examples of these cars. They are not looking for nostalgia alone. They are looking for an escape from the digital complexity of modern life. In a new car, a failed sensor or a software glitch can render the vehicle undrivable. In the W124, the systems are mechanical, logical, and understandable. It is a car that can be fixed with a wrench rather than a laptop. It represents a partnership between the driver and the machine, a relationship based on mutual respect and care. But this level of material quality and engineering integrity came with a significant drawback. Building a car this way was incredibly expensive. The profit margins were slim, and the development times were long. While the engineers were celebrating their triumph of durability, the accountants in the boardroom were looking at the balance sheets with growing alarm. They realized that the company could not survive if it continued to build cars that lasted forever while costing a fortune to produce. A change was coming, and it would shake the foundation of the brand. The change that was coming would prove to be absolute. The financial reality of the early 1990s was harsh, and the philosophy of cost, no object engineering was about to collide with a global recession. The catalyst for this shift was not actually the E-Class itself, but its larger sibling, the W140S class. That flagship vehicle had been developed with the same obsessive mindset, but it had grown so large, so heavy, and so expensive that it became a symbol of excess in a world that was suddenly tightening its belt. The board of directors looked at the shrinking profit margins and made a decision that would alter the course of the company forever. The era of the engineer running the show was over. The era of the accountant had begun. In the early 90s, a new management structure took control, led eventually by Jürgen Schrempp. The directive was clear and uncompromising. The company could no longer afford to build cars that lasted forever if it meant selling them at a price that yielded minimal profit. The mandate for the successor to the W124, a car known as the W210, was shocking to the old guard. The production costs had to be slashed. Reports from the time suggest the target was to reduce manufacturing costs by nearly 30% compared to the outgoing model. To achieve a 30% reduction in cost on a complex machine requires more than just efficiency. It requires a fundamental downgrade in materials. When the W210 launched in 1995, the difference was immediately palpable. The design abandoned the stern, rectangular authoritarianism of the past in favor of a softer, rounder face with 4 circular headlights. But the real changes were hidden beneath the skin, and they would soon reveal themselves in disastrous fashion. The company had switched to water-based paints to comply with new environmental regulations. However, the application process was not yet perfected. Combined with the use of thinner, less expensive sheet metal and a reduction in the anti-corrosion dipping processes, this created a perfect storm for oxidation. Within a few years, the new models began to rust. They did not rust in the slow, predictable manner of the vintage cars. They rusted aggressively. Doors bubbled at the bottom. Spring perches, the structural cups that held the suspension springs to the body, would simply disintegrate, causing the suspension to collapse while the car was moving. The reputation for invincibility that the W124 had spent a decade building was dismantled in a fraction of that time. Taxi drivers in Germany, who had been the brand's most loyal evangelists, began to defect in droves to other manufacturers. They realized that the new tools were not built like the old tools. The W124 was a car you bought for life. The W210 was a car you leased for 3 years and then returned before the warranty expired. The production of the W124 sedan ended in 1995, though the wagon and convertible variants lingered until 1997. As the final examples rolled off the line in Sindelfingen, the workers likely knew they were witnessing the end of an industrial chapter. They were assembling the last Mercedes-Benz that was built without compromise. The cars that followed were faster, safer on paper, and far more advanced digitally, but they lacked the soul of the machine that came before them. They lacked the dense, heavy feeling of permanence. The W124 stands today as a monument to a specific moment in history. It represents the absolute zenith of mechanical engineering, right before the world pivoted to digital integration and cost optimization. It serves as a reminder of what happens when a company decides that the product matters more than the profit margin. It is a physical object that proves quality is not just a marketing buzzword, but a tangible reality that you can feel in the weight of a door and the silence of a cabin at speed. This machine serves as the bridge between the analog world we lost and the digital world we inhabit today. The lost luxury of this car is not found in soft leather or wood trim, but in the profound peace of mind that comes from absolute mechanical integrity. Modern cars are appliances that serve us, but the W124 remains a true companion. If you want to understand why we still obsess over this era of engineering, subscribe for more stories from the past.